Welcome back, viewers. It's been some time, and today with us we have a very interesting guest and a even more interesting topic. Our guest is Alan Machado. He's been here before, but as the author of some other books, 2 or 3 other books. This book is Alan's new book, just out, making waves, stirring some discussion, quite some discussion. It's called Goa's Inquisition: Facts, Fiction, Factoids. Now, as you know, I don't like to talk too much on this program, but today I have to do a little bit of the setting of the program, because before we get caught up into too many details, just to explain in a sentence or 2 or 3 what the book is all about. So what Alan is saying here, it's a very detailed, very fact-based, very research-based study of the Goa Inquisition. As we know, the Goa Inquisition is this huge issue which has always come up in Goan history, in understanding Goan Christianity, in understanding the Portuguese in Goa. And the shocking thing that Alan is telling us is that much of what we believe on the Goa Inquisition is actually partly false or even totally false. So it's important to say here at this stage that he's not challenging the historians from a faith perspective. He's challenging them from the point of view of history and the facts of history. What he is saying is something that can really reshape the debate about Goa, about its past, about how we understand our religion. But he is it's not a kind of a defensive denial of history. So anyway, with that, I'll take you over to Alan. Nice to have you, Alan.
Thank you, Rico.
Just to get in at the deep end of your book, how many years did it take you to make, and what was your intention while writing it?
I think this must have taken about 5-6 years in researching. I went into the topic because I had just completed a book on Indian history, from early Indian history, called Rediscovering India, which is under publication, and which traces
with Orient Long Man.
With the Orient Black Swan.
Black Swan.
And it traces a lot of things from the genetic aspects, the linguistic aspects, archaeology, archaeobotany, Harappa, Indo-Aryan migrations, as such. So then I said, let me focus it down and bring that down into Goa in a smaller booklet form, on different aspects of this. So one of the aspects I kept as Inquisition, Goa's Inquisition. And that's when, in researching, I found a lot of primary documentation, primary meaning the original documents of the Inquisition, some dating back to 1560s, when the Inquisition started, right up to 1812, when it was closed. So that's 252 years. And these documents have been digitized and have been uploaded, and it's available to a lot of people online. Whoever has a computer can approach this with a wire. So this led me off into a totally different direction. And with the background that we had, which is largely from very limited secondary sources, booklets and some things. So I got a totally different perspective of what was going on, factual based, and it required a lot of analysis, a lot of documentation, and I've gone practically they listed out more than 8,000 odd names, plus another 3,500 odd names available. So this gives us a very different picture of what we had been led to believe. So it's a detailed picture, and it will come up a bit later.
So if I'm to get you right, Alan, just correct me. What you are saying here is that our understanding is suffused by a whole lot of myths and flaws in how we see the Inquisition. It was an institution which lasted 252 years, and in that time, the number of people sentenced to death, that is burning by stake, was about 170 or whatever. Correct me on the figures. If you look at it, it was a judicial process, and scholars like David Higgs and all suggest that the Inquisition was even comparable in its justice and in its methodologies to the civil procedures of those times. Am I getting you right?
Yes, in fact, the Inquisition is I would say was a still, from the judicial aspect, a still better system, because the inquisitors all were highly qualified persons. Then there were what are called the regimentos, or rules laid down as how each case was to be handled, the number of witnesses to be called, when an arrest was to be made, how a trial was to be conducted. All these were documented. So it was a very perhaps one of the most best rigorously justifiable justice system that was there. It was one of three courts in Goa. One was the civil court, which handled civil matters. Then you had an ecclesiastical court, which handled church matters and matters related to morals and other things. Then you had the Inquisition court. Now, the court of the Inquisition did not report to the Pope or to any church authority. It reported directly to the king, not even to the viceroy. It reported to the king in Portugal. But it drew its legitimacy from the Pope's bull of certain things. So the inquisitors were appointed by the king, and these were had to have the highest qualification either in theology and church law, or in some of them had even in civil law. It drew a lot of its practices from civil codes and from Roman law and from canon law. But ultimately it only judged. It never punished directly. It imposed penances or punishments in the nature of spiritual penances, also in terms of corporal punishments of varying degrees. And these were handed over to secular authority to complete the corporal punishments, or to church authority to do the spiritual penances, like penances, going to mass on Sundays with a candle in your hand, barefoot.
So from small punishments to big ones.
Yes. And some absolutions as well. Some were absolved. And especially in the case of if somebody came and denounced with a false denunciation as a false witness, then the case was transferred on. The case was dropped, and the person who gave false testimony was investigated and punished, and quite severely too.
Which brings us to the next point. If that is the case, why this image of the Inquisition as this bad, ugly, terrible, brutal system, a big stain on the Catholic Church, which clouds not only the debate over religion and the debate over belief, but also the debate over colonial history, the debate over the equation between Goa and the Portuguese, and a whole lot of other things, including politics today. People would still, if they want to win the score a point, they'd say like, you had the Inquisition kind of thing. So why this image?
There's more than one reason. I think the primary reason is ignorance, which is due to the Inquisition itself, because it kept all its documents secret, and they were secret and meant only for the Inquisition hierarchy, and certain documents were sent to the king, like the years, if supposing there was an execution, somebody had been handed over this one, it had to be approved in Portugal. So then the number of persons investigated and who appeared in auto de face, that list was prepared and sent to Portugal, to the king himself. So these documents, all these things, the Inquisition kept a record of each and every case that they could, as well as they could be kept in those centuries. A lot of them were lost, and many of them were destroyed in 1812. A lot of them were lost during the Maratha incursions.
1812 why?
1812 was when the Inquisition was permanently closed. Then during the Maratha...
Under pressure from the British to a certain extent?
Partly from the British and partly because, it had long since served its purpose.
Sorry, I'm distracting you. I'm distracting you from the wider issue of why.
No, it's good, Then also during the Maratha incursions of 1683, when 1739, when these documents were packed and sent to Marma Goa, some were burnt and such things. A lot of mix-up took place. And then, of course, Goa's climate is quite not very conducive to keeping paper documents. These documents were kept in a room of the Sabayo Palace, that is the palace of the Inquisition, or Vodlangar,
which existed very close to
Say Cathedral. We could talk about it also in some detail. In the Vodlangar, there was a secret room called the Secreto, and there were only 3 keys available. They were permanently locked, and 3 keys were available. 2 were with each inquisitor. There were only 2 inquisitors, and the third one was with the promoter. Now, the promoter was the prosecuting attorney. So this was all that was there, and there were very rigid rules as how these documents were to be handled, how they were to be stored, and such things, so that they could be easily retrieved. Now, that was the primary reason that happened. The Inquisition itself never bothered to counter any propaganda or any this thing. It never tried to defend itself. And I'm not here to defend the Inquisition, neither am I here to condemn it. I just want to lay bare what I have learnt about it. If others look at the same documents, they may come to different conclusions. Now, when you come to this question of the other reason for this, is what I believe is that during times of conflict, there are always some particular icon that is targeted, and then everything is associated with that. Now, at least 3-4 cases I can point out where this Inquisition hysteria, if you want to call it, took a certain momentum. The first, and this is the time, and these are associated with what is called the Black Legend. Now, the first instance, and this is the time when the Black Legend was created.
Black Legend, can you explain?
A Black Legend is where, something is painted in black, which is a color.
Blacker than what it is?
Yes. And quite a bit is where the fact turns to fiction and to factoid, when it is believed. When fiction is believed as a fact, it becomes a factoid. So, during the Spain had occupied Netherlands in the 16th century, and when the Dutch were fighting back, so
for their independence,
and Elizabethan England joined the Dutch. So there was an alliance of Dutch and English, and fighting back against the Spaniards. Now, this military offensive, it was just the time when printing had started to take off, and it became a powerful tool in spreading this.
Printing.
Yeah.
Printing became a powerful tool.
Yeah, the printed page. It was handwritten pages.
Yeah.
So you could disseminate information very rapidly on a larger scale.
Like the internet today.
Yeah, like the internet or WhatsApp today, So this was employed very skillfully to spread this information and create this information or misinformation about the Spanish Inquisition, because the Portuguese was not involved in this particular conflict. But by association, it got
and actually
a bit of blackness.
Portugal was ruled by Spain for a certain number of years, and
I think that is from about 1580 or so.
Yeah, for 60 years.
The Cardinal Henrik, he is the gentleman who was the first inquisitor and who created
So then the Black Legend has also been much discussed on the net and in academia and things like that, of how the war of independence by the Dutch turned into a kind of conflict with the Spaniards, and to project them in a certain way.
Yes.
So the Spanish colonies are shown as the most brutal in the world, and the Dutch ones are not so focused on. Generally in the discussion of Brits, you never hear something bad about the Brits and things like that. So it's almost like your colonialism is worse than my colonialism kind of thing. Anyway,
I think all of them have the same sort of picture.
With different degrees and
whenever there is
emphasis.
Emphasis. Then this particular legend was brought to India again during another time of conflict. In the sense, it was just the beginning of the 19th century. That's 1806 or so, just after Napoleon's this thing, when Wellington had just defeated Tipu Sultan and had occupied Goa. It was a time when the military sudden expansion in territory got accompanied by a kind of a Protestant evangelism financed both from America and England. So, and that is the time when one Protestant reverend, that is Claudius Buchanan, arrived in India, and he toured right from Bengal down the south and landed up in Goa because it was under British occupation. And there he gives his version, which again is a very colorful, dark, blackish version of the
Buchanan
Inquisition.
has a lot of nasty things to say of all different religions, which he is not part of, I guess, including
Yes.
including in Orissa and
Yes, he witnessed the Jagannath Rath Yatra, and what he says there is something quite horrific. But
and the word Jaggernaut comes from the word Jagannath.
Jagannath, yes.
So it's all like, misunderstanding each other's beliefs and traditions and cultures and adding a lot of masala to what you encounter, I guess.
Then the next phase comes during the war of, when the Goans rose up against the Portuguese and tried to
Around
become
61.
independent. 60,
Yes,
61,
61.
a little earlier as well.
When Piolkar's book comes out.
Priolkar's book comes just before, it's 1561. So,
1961.
Yeah. So over there again, the Inquisition becomes a little target. But it's not just for Priolkar, it is also for Kuna.
T.P. Cunha, Tristram Biganze Cunha.
Yeah. He also writes about the Inquisition in quite a
Glaringly critical tone.
critical tone, yes.
And you're saying he has painted broad strokes based on what others have said
Yes.
earlier.
And again, when you come to it, all these are secondary sources. For instance, Priolkar's book, about a third of it is devoted to Delon's and Buchanan's narrative.
Verbatim.
Yeah. And Buchanan's narrative only relating to Goa Inquisition, he ignores all the stories about Jagannath Yatra and the
Other
other things.
disparaging comments about
Yes.
different forms
Yes.
of religion.
Then another third more or less goes into issues that are not directly concerned with the Goa's Inquisition. That's the Spanish Inquisition, the Portuguese Inquisition, conversion laws and such things. Also including about 12 pages or so on the authenticity of Delon's account, which was being disputed by Christian Goans. That's I think Gerson Dacona and some others.
Bombay-based Goa Christian.
Which these 12 pages could have been dismissed in half a paragraph, because Priolkar refers to Baião, a Portuguese curator of one of the libraries around the maybe 30s, 1930s or so, or 50, I think 30s. And he brought out a book based from Coimbra University. And this mentions, there is reference to Delon in that. In fact, a facsimile of the entry of Delon's name as Carlos de Long Frances, which appears
Carlos Delon.
Yeah. Which appears in the inventory of 1774. So, if you just wanted to show its authenticity, if I was writing it, I would just show this and say, yes,
he was there.
I don't need to say anything more.
Yeah, he was part of it.
So there was no need to add another 12 pages to say something else. So, in fact, I think viewers may like to know who was Delon.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Now, Delon was a French doctor who had come to India with the French East India Company and had done a little bit of investigative tours for them. It was then based in Surat. And he had gone down the coast. He had come to Goa as well, gave quite good accounts of the different institutions, the way the government operated, including he makes a reference of the Sabayo Palace from outside. Very soon he was to get inside as well. But that said, so when he went back he then decided to go to China, but then on the way in Damao, the governor persuaded him to stay. And eventually that turned into something hostile with the governor because of certain jealousies or whatever. And he became an Inquisition target because for heresy. Now, the Inquisition primary purpose was to use heresy laws. Okay.
Heresy meaning something going against the doctrine of the faith?
Against the orthodoxy. You see, any faith of a type of the Christian nature or church must have a constitution or must have a certain set of rules, and this is called orthodoxy. So it has to be protected. If people deviate from that or try to undermine it, then they are what is called heretics in some ways.
looked upon very seriously in medieval times.
Yes, yes. Heresy, in fact, in Roman law was equated with treason, because church, religion and kingship went
Hand in
hand
hand.
in hand. And this was not just there, it's also in Islamic law. One of the famous Islamic historians, I forget the full name, but Ibn something.
Ibn Said. Siena.
No. It's something with K. He mentions kingship and religion are brothers. Okay, in administrative and of people in governing a place. So Delors eventually spent 2-3 years in the prison, and he participated in the auto da fe of 1676, and he was sent back to France as to serve in the galleys, but from there he used his influence and got released. Okay, and then he was also entailed, because one of the conditions of release from the by the Inquisition was that you do not reveal, you take a vow not to reveal anything outside.
I see.
Of course, I think we are fortunate in getting Delors' book, because we get a lot of inside information of how it operated. But it was used in the Black Legend, okay, and again selectively used. Let's put it that way, because Delors himself mentions that the Inquisition may be good in some ways. That is never mentioned by anybody who was in the Black Legend.
So while we are on that point, it takes us to the connected issue of the Goa Inquisition statistics, what you call. Okay. So you say that it lasted for 252 years, from 1561 to 1812. In this period, the number of people tried was 19,000, maybe plus or minus, because you might have missed out a few couple of thousand or whatever. So 19,000 people were tried. We are not talking about people being sentenced to death or something, but just trials. However,
can I just explain how I arrived at that figure?
Just one sec. Then you go to the details. Okay. The number of auto da fes is 176. Okay. Auto da fes, some of us think that it's a trial by fire, auto da fe, because it sounds like fe is fire, but it's actually, as you pointed out, it's an act of faith.
Yes.
So it's a procession where you can explain later what happens. And burning in effigy was 154, where the persons were not present, so maybe a small statue representing them was burnt in effigy, 154, and physically burnt in these 252 years were 177. When I read your book, I got the impression that what you were saying is it needs to be seen in context of a judicial system where even till today, the number of people being executed, for example, execution and death sentence is out of fashion now, but in those days it was very much in fashion. Now this idea of burning at the stake sounds particularly brutal and medieval, probably because it was medieval, but as you were explaining in your other talks, which I also was part of, you could tell us why burning by stake, what were the other forms of death sentences in those days. So just to please carry on with the numbers, give us a context.
Yeah, coming to the first one about the numbers. Now, most authors have so far, most authors means that is basically Bayan, whom I talked about earlier, Antonio Bayan. He takes his figure from the 1774 inventory. Now, this inventory list is available. It is available in the Torre de Tombe in Lisbon, and it is digitized. You can download it.
You can read it from Goa.
Yes. Part of the world. You can read it sitting anywhere you want, as long as you got a laptop and internet.
And some knowledge of Portuguese which you picked up along the way.
Yes, because most of it is just names. There are a few explanatory notes which you don't really, you can read them, and one of the explanatory notes mentions why for some years the documents were lost because of the Maratha invasions, 1740. They had packed them and trying to send to Marmagua. So Bayan arrives at a figure of about 16,000 or odd. I have done the same calculation and have counted all these, and I come, my figure is just about 12 or 13 more or less. So that 16,500 or so is the figure that comes from the inventory. But what he has not done is analyze the auto de fe lists. Now these lists have been, they were compiled and sent to Lisbon every year. Some of them were lost in shipwrecks. Some have been lost in some archive or so, but there are quite a number left over there. In the Torah, the tomb itself preserves a large number of these lists. Then another list was compiled by a gentleman called Antonio Moriara from the Lisbon Public Library, National Library, that was in around 1850 or 1860, something like that. And that book is also digitized and it is available. Then there are some lists that are available by a gentleman, by one of the inquisitors called Figuera. He compiled all the names that he could from 1561 really, because they came at the end of December 1560, from 1561 to 1623. Then from 1623 to 1650, there's a big gap. This one comes from 1650. These were the times of the Dutch wars. So a lot of shipwrecks have been there and they have been lost. So I have compiled this complete list on Excel sheets, and adding to that, I have compared
with names.
Yes, of course, with names and all the details that are there. You know, what is his caste, what is his place of origin, what is his place of residence,
what he was accused of,
what was his punishment meted out, if it was a woman, who was the husband, if it was a bachelor or a single lady, who was the father. All that is there. Okay, so I compared these because they don't match. The inventory list and this don't match thoroughly, the same thing. You see, you must understand that some documents had been sent to Lisbon as well, which have been lost here. So putting all this together, I arrive at a figure just under 19,000. Now, there are some years that are lost. So if you make some statistical analysis for that, averaging it out, I think you may arrive at a figure 23,000 who have been totally prosecuted.
In 252 years, that is 100 cases a year. Who have been prosecuted. We are not talking about sentenced to death. We are just talking about prosecutions.
Not even prosecuted, who have been investigated. Because my figure shows about 4% of these were absolved.
What kind of punishments would they get?
Okay. Now, to a large extent, many of them received spiritual punishments. One of the purposes of the Inquisition was to shame the individual. So he was he had to wear some particular dress, which you find in some of the figures. It's also there if you see it. And over that he wore a cape called a San Benito or a Samara if he was condemned to death. And if he had committed certain kind of offenses like sorcery, or he was a dogmatic heretic, or had given false testimony, then he wore a sort of a dunce cap, which was called a carocha, and on that you had all these the offense listed. So, and then you were paraded through the streets in an auto de fe, and you wore it as you abjured and received your absolution. So one was the costume of shaming, of infamy, if you want to call it. The second thing was you got a list of spiritual penances. For instance, if you are a bit of ignorant in the Christian faith, because a lot of people had been recently converted and they didn't know a lot of things. So you had a spell of instruction, spiritual instruction. Then you had some penances, like holding a candle and going to the church barefoot and attending mass on Sundays and holy days for so many days. And if you look at Delons, he had to say a certain Our Father, Hail Mary, and that sort of thing for so many years and all that sort of thing. There were also some spells where you spent in isolation in a monastery to reflect on your things, probably bread and water. Then there was exile. Then there were punishments, physical corporal punishments, like being sent to the Polvara. The Polvara was the gunpowder factory. It was located quite close from where we are sitting, at least in Old Goa. In Old Goa. Then you had the galleys.
For hard work?
Yeah, gunpowder is physical work.
Work.
If you like to know what it is, I mean, to get an idea, if you go to Old Goa, you will see these granite
stones.
Mills are
huge ones.
They're about 6 feet or more in diameter.
And you're grinding it?
I don't know how it was done.
Okay.
Maybe they had some bullocks to grind it, or maybe you had to push it or what. But it was not a physically quite a exhausting job, I think. And a lot of women were sent there to gunpowder for 1 year, 2 years, sometimes more than that, 5, 6 years maybe. Then to the galleys. Now, galleys doesn't mean you are sent to the ships. You worked in the dockyard, more or less. And the dockyard was very close to, if you go down the Viceroy's Arch, towards the left side, there's a small stone called the Quay. And that was where the galleys were. Okay. You perhaps loaded, unloaded ships. Maybe you built ships. I don't know what all sort of things, because it's not specified. But galleys didn't mean that you were shipped out into this thing. Then you had, and this is more I find in the statistics, I am yet to finalize a list, whipping, which is quite common. I find the majority of the people who were whipped were non-Christians. Okay, not so many Christians as such. And some of the whipping was done while you were led through the streets, and some of it was possibly done at what was the whipping post, which somebody has it's now being misnamed as a hand cutting post.
Hat Katra Khambo. Yeah. So it has a Konkani name which suggests it's a hand cutting post, but it's
but I believe it was more a whipping post,
a kind of
because pillory, which and because it is called a pillory.
In Portuguese, it's a Pelourinho Novo, so
it is
the
called
new
a
pillory.
Yeah.
And in European cities, many of these cities do have pillories. They've become tourist attractions. I remember stocks going and posing there in the stocks, and they click a photo of you and things like that.
They let you off? No.
Unfortunately.
No, fortunately, I would say. Others, we won't be sitting here. But also, there were some in which, in some cases, because it depended on the year and the inquisitor and what was happening. For instance, if you are a blasphemer, and they would gag you and lead you through the streets, because the purpose of that, apart from saying that your mouth had certain things, it was also maybe you'd start blabbering out and scandalizing others.
How does it compare with the punishment systems of those times? Because that might be a more apt comparison than thinking with a 21st century perspective.
You see, it's a little difficult to do, because I've not investigated that as such. But if you look at Elizabethan punishments, these are quite, many of them are available. You can look at them online. For instance, a person condemned for treason. There were two types of treason in English law at that time, 1560, 1600s. One was treason against the king and his family, which was high treason. Then you had petty treason, which was against your spouse. For instance, if a wife was accused or condemned of murdering, convicted of murdering her husband, then she was guilty of petty treason. Now, for petty treason, now for high treason, the person, especially in Elizabethan England, special punishment was devised for that. That is called hung, drawn, and quartered. To be hanged, first they would hang the person, but not until he was dead. He was asphyxiated and sort of survived, cut down before that. Then he was laid down, disemboweled, castrated, and all these entrails pulled out and burnt in front of him. I mean, he would have been dead by then, but the crowd was there baying for his blood. Then his limbs were cut, his head was cut, and they were sent to different cities and put out. So that was hung, drawn, and quartered. So that was one of the punishments there. Now, for women were never subjected to this punishment because of the out of modesty, but they were burnt.
So burning at the stake comes here in what context? We are talking about 177 cases in 252 years. So it's not the images that are portrayed of pictures where people everything is going up in flames kind of thing. It's not as dramatic as probably it's made out to be. And in fact, there is this excellent documentary called The Myth of the Spanish Inquisition done by BBC, which discusses all these issues in a Spanish context. And I know you have also made this point that Spain is different from Goa and Portugal. But in some ways, there's a common thread running through. And they also say that, the press and all that played up on these issues hugely. So in our mind, when we think of Inquisition, we think of burning at the stake. As per your book, give or take a few, cases, you are saying that 177 persons were burnt at the stake over 252 years. That is slightly less than one per year. So what were these people guilty of?
You see, basically, a person was given a lot of leeway. Most of them would have been relapses. In the sense, they had been punished earlier, and then they were punished again, and for mostly heresy and apostasy. Okay, they were sodomites who were burnt because their sin is considered as a crime against nature and God. But largely it was because of heresy, and largely it was not for the first offense, but it was for the second or third offense. Now, in the Inquisition had been given a directive to act mildly, because the purpose of the Inquisition was not to drive people away. Understand this. The purpose of the Inquisition was to keep people within a certain discipline.
Getting the loyalty for the church and state?
Yeah.
You made that point. Could you
Yes.
explain that a bit?
Yeah. You see, what happened to, when Portugal expanded overseas, it created a lot of pores over a very diverse population base, right from Brazil to Europe to Africa, India, and again, India is a very diverse place. Then Sri Lanka, Ceylon at the time. Then you had in Macau. And the people spoke different languages, they had different gods, they had different cultures, and they wore different clothes. So the Portuguese king and the policy was to try and make them under one kind of a uniform kind of cultural entity based on a model which they had adopted against their own Jews and Muslims who were there before this.
Before the reconquest, after the reconquest.
Yeah, that is in the late, almost the end of the 15th century. So this model was applied here to some extent, but they also knew that here, like for instance, there's a big difference in Portugal itself between how Jews were treated and how Muslims were treated. Muslims were allowed to, if they didn't want to convert, they were allowed to leave and go to North Africa because North Africa was close by.
They could conduct business from there.
Yeah, of course. But North Africans could retaliate. The empires there, if something was like this. So they said, okay, you can go. But Jews had nowhere to go. So they said, okay, you have no option. Now, the situation was similar to here in the sense that you had a lot of, Goa was a small place and surrounded by all Muslim nations and rulers as well as
Portuguese perspective, hostile forces.
Yeah. So you could not antagonize the others. Okay, so you had to, and it was very easy to slip across the border. So the inquisitors were advised in more than one way to act with new converts with mildness. And what that means is, I mean, people may question what is this mildness. But the thing was that if you're a new convert, during certain decades, in the earlier decades, you were not to be prosecuted for the first 10 or 20 years. It's only after that, if you continued with your older practices, then you are hauled up a bit. Whether this was a uniform application or not, I don't know. But there was a little statement like this, and even the provisional councils say this. The other reason was you didn't want to drive away the subject population. You wanted to keep them here. That is why you said, and conversion did not mean just conversion by religion. It meant conversion in culture as well.
Which was very important in those days, no? In those days?
Yes.
In a European context?
Yeah, I mean, in any context it becomes, because when you want to unify and make this thing, names, for instance, all that sort of thing. That's why you could not take you preserve your old name as such, pre-conversion name.
In Goa.
Yeah. But we Mangaloreans, we left at a time before all this settled in. So many of us remember our pre-conversion names. And that is where my Prabhu comes in, Although I am not baptized Prabhu, but today my children are baptized Prabhu, they are Prabhus. Yeah.
You presented this slew of facts. What if someone says you're being defensive about the Inquisition, or you're trying to rewrite history, or how would you respond to that?
Rewriting history is a cliche which is just used when somebody doesn't want to agree with certain things. But history has to be rewritten when new facts emerge.
In the light of new facts.
I don't say facts as such, I say evidence. You see, because some of it maybe, who knows who was this person who wrote it at that time, how accurate he was, or whether he had any bias. So you try to investigate also and find out about this person if you can. Otherwise, you have to come to some conclusions based on this. So rewriting is a process which continues as and when new information comes out. You can't stick to something like that.
What has been the response to the book?
I think it has been good, very good.
Also, since you are challenging something that everyone believed in so strongly, there are so many books that have come out based on the Inquisition, based on torture during the Inquisition, in Konkani, in English, in Western, even at the global level, there are books set in Goa on the Inquisition. Suddenly, you are saying that you're removing the plank from under someone's feet and saying that what you believed in for so many years, decades, centuries is probably quite away from the truth. So I think there is an element of culture shock that you're bringing in here, isn't it?
And I suppose a resistance as well to having to see something new coming out which undermines what you have been believing or saying all this time. I think it's a matter of time, and that's why I'm very open. I'm not defensive. As I said, and I repeat this again, I don't defend the Inquisition, nor do I condemn it. I am only laying out what I have accessed, and I say you are free to access it. It is not secret. It is
someone
available.
young wanting to go into researching it. What's your suggestion? What should they be looking at? Which are the areas which are still untouched? Where are the cobwebs?
You see, there is still a vast store of documents that need to be studied, and some of this is being studied by a younger generation of Portuguese, and one Italian scholar is also there whom I know of. And in Brazil, a lot of them doing it. The University of Sao Paulo has got a repository in which you can access.
For the Goa Inquisition, no? Goa.
And you can access it.
It's open. It's online.
Yeah, it's online. That was the Figueroa's list. From there are about 3,500 names there, which give complete details. They're all in Portuguese. So a little bit of study you have to do of Portuguese.
One very critical issue which comes up in Goa, particularly relevant to us, the role of Saint Francis Xavier in the Inquisition. I know you have a chapter on that. So,
yeah, I have a chapter on why the Inquisition came, but I cannot come up with a chapter on Francis Xavier's role because it's only confined to one single letter, as far as anybody has cited and found out. And that letter dates to a time when Francis Xavier had already left Goa and was on the way to Japan. And from the island of Moluccas, which is in Indonesia today, he wrote a letter about 14 years before he died, before the Inquisition came, and 8 years before he died actually. So this letter, all it states is, I have searched for this letter in the some of the translations of his letters by a Jesuit priest, Costello, but I have not found it.
Costello.
But it appears in Silvarego in some place, and all it says is, it's a letter writing to the king saying, in your forts and fortresses all along the Indian Ocean and
India meant this full space from Mozambique to Timor, yes. Probably.
Basically, in those days, the concept was more from Ethiopia eastwards. Anything of that was sort of
India.
That was the geographical knowledge of that time, understanding. So
in the forts and fortresses.
Yeah, because all the settlements, if you want to call it, and so there were a lot of Jewish and Muslim influences which was corrupting the Christians there. Therefore, send the Inquisition to investigate these things and take appropriate action. It never refers to anything to do with Indians. It never refers to anything to do with Gentios. That was the term used for what we call Hindus today. Yeah. So it is, to me, it is not correct that you blame Francis Xavier for this. He had nothing to do, and he died long before. He died 8 years before the Inquisitors came to India, and this letter was written 14 years before. It was a very complex process that brought the Inquisition here. There are reasons which are given in the book. I don't know if we need to go into them, but you will find that in the book quite clearly drawn up.
two things I want to just focus a little time on. One is, of course, the book itself and what it contains, because that would be interesting to people who want to know. But before that, I didn't introduce you adequately, I think, because I was so, I was jumping ahead of the story with the book and wanted to put it out there. You're not a historian. You are an engineer educated in the Indian Institute of Sciences. Your passion is history. I won't call you a historian because unlike some of us, like journalists, we accept everyone in our flock. Anyone can write. But historians don't like people claiming to be historians when they are not trained in the historical process and all that, whatever. But your passion is history, no doubt. You have written books called Saraswati's Children on the history of the Mangaloreans. You have written a book called Shades Within Shadows.
That's a novel.
Yeah, that's a novel set in again the Mangalorean Christian community which you are part of. And lastly, Slaves Within Sultans. That's a history, a very thick, almost 400-500 page history of the Mangalorean Christians again, and their time when they were enslaved by Tipu Sultan and all that, which you have a very different take on. But we won't go into that because there are other interviews which we have done. We have done one earlier, so all the details are there on that. Tell us.
You missed out rediscovering India under publication.
Yes, which is under publication from Orient
Black
Swan. And that's expected soon, and that's a pan-Indian story of the history of India, looking at a very interesting DNA, kind of evolutionary point of view. But tell us how Alan Machado, the engineer trained in IISc, Indian Institute of Science, one of our prestigious institutions, took so deeply to history. Of course, I know other engineers and scientists who are deep into history, whether it's Themistocles de Silva writing on ROC or Bernard Souza writing on Aldona and all that. But tell us about your experience. Briefly, how did you get involved?
See, essentially, I have been a voracious reader right from my school days. In fact, even in school, I used to read about the Russian Revolution. I could tell you a lot at that time, and I still remember some of the details of those books I read. Whatever I could lay hands on, especially, I was very interested in the way people behave and how power behaves and other things like that. Then as you get a little older, you search for identities, where you come from, what you are, who are we. And then I was searching for roots on our own this thing, and Mangalorean. There was very little written about it. And whatever little was there...
Praxi Fernandez, Storm over Srirangapatnam, a few others. No?
Yeah, but
very few.
Some of it to a logical person, because engineering teach you to be logic and step by step. It always starts with ab initio from the beginning, ABCs, and then build up the case. You can't jump to a conclusion and then try to support the case and keep other things.
True.
So I found these things like this. For instance, in the Mangalorean history, why Tipu took us captive. The reasons they give is, most of them say, because we supported the English. Now we are farmers. We are sitting in some village somewhere else. There's a war going on between about 1,000 white men who have usurped a fort, and Tipu is this one. How do we support?
What do you do?
We are wearing our footwear and our this thing, and if you don't know how to use a gun, how do you support? So, it does not...
It does not tie up.
Yeah.
So, it does not add up.
So then you start investigating, and then you find the story is different. It's the same thing with this book. The conclusions that have arrived for different reasons, then we lose
they would often say that the Goans ran away to Mangalore because of the Inquisition.
Yeah.
Now, if you're going to run away there and become the most devout Catholics there, stay the most devout Catholics, and import your priest from Goa under the Portuguese authorities, doesn't make sense again.
It absolutely does not. And when you look at the figures, the statistics, you find that the time of maximum migration to Canara was a time when the Inquisition was operating in the province of the north, that is from Bombay to Damau. It was not in Goa. In Goa, there was they had handed over to a certain extent the responsibility for looking after things to Nayaks, that were Christians, elite Christians. There were about 35 who could be appointed in Salsett, about 12 each in Bardez and Tiswadi. But you find, when you look at the cases, the majority of the cases are in the north.
Very interesting.
So you look at, and then you look at the next thing, why doesn't it still migrate? It is economic reasons.
Yeah.
It's economic reasons.
Yeah, that's of course covered on. But give us a gist of what's in the book to wind up. If you could tell us the chapter, maybe a chapter by chapter, just a
I'll
brief
have
summary.
to
Yeah.
refresh my
Please,
thing,
please,
but,
please. You can just look at it and brief us on what's there. I think it has a very nice design and get up and unusual in its.
that was done by my daughter Alpa. She's a design engineer, a graphic designer. So that's all her own thing. I gave her freedom to do it
Nicely.
in the way, because basically it was to appeal to people and not go through the same old things.
Correct.
So this basically the thread comes in covering the different aspects of the Goa's Inquisition.
There are 32 chapters, but you could point to some of the most significant ones.
For instance, if you take on the Vodlangar, I think a lot of people would be interested in the where this was and how it was. This was the old palace of the Bijapur palace, one of the palaces maybe, and which was handed over to the Inquisition when it arrived in 1560. They modified it to add prisons at the back, and this has a very interesting tale. The Inquisitor lived here. It had 2 floors, ground and first floor, and then on top there was an annex where the one Inquisitor lived. But the surprising thing, and I think is that the bottom floor had large rooms, 8 large rooms, which there's a legend on this particular plan of 1779, which states very clearly that these rooms M and N, marked M and N, have been were always rented out to gentios. So now you look at a palace which is, a prison and administrative building of the Inquisition, which is supposed to be highly secretive and defended, and you have rooms rented out. And one of the rooms is a butcher shop. And the other thing that you see is when you read this correspondence that of the documents which are there now in the library at Rio de Janeiro, you find that the Lisbon a couple of times writing letters to Goa to say have the butcher shop removed from there. Then also that there were problems in collecting rents. So these are some of the details that these documents reveal. Now, I've given quite a lot of detail on how the Inquisition operated, what was the process, because these are from the regimentos.
You've also focused on certain villages now.
Yes.
Like
for instance, in Asolna in 1686 and in Kukuli in 1694, a lot of villages, I think it is about 100 and odd in Asolna and about 90 odd in Kukuli, I can't remember exactly, signed a formal abjuration. That means saying in formal terms, I will not do these things again, and I will accept the Pope so and so as my guide, and these are the things that we do, and I formally abjure, and that sort of thing. You see? So it was a sort of a bond of loyalty, you might say, that was signed.
I see. And also Timi and Aldona?
Yes.
These are all border villages in those days, where the international border was.
TV was, Aldona was a border village, but TV was in the forefront. You know, there were a lot of the major defensive line was being constructed there from 1635 to about 1730 or something like that. And the process of constructing, that is why I said a little earlier, these economic reasons. The reason for in constructing these forts, the tradition was that half the expense was to be paid by the local Gaonkaris. So there was a big burden on the Gaonkaris. The second thing was that young men were conscripted to work on these fortifications, and they were also conscripted to have man the garrisons. So the fields were left unattended, uncultivated. So there were big shortages of food developing, and that is why famine and shortage of foods, it drives people away. People have to go for better sources. And the Viceroy himself said a lot of people from TV about 1660s had migrated to Goa, to Canara.
And this point on the 1684 ban on Konkani, what are you saying on it?
The ban on Konkani, it's not fully applicable to the Inquisition, except that one of the inquisitors had said that this ban should have been implemented, it would have been better. But
There's misreading on that also, you're suggesting?
Yes, there is.
In what form?
There are 2-3 studies been made. One, I think, has been done by Delio Mendonça, which is the thing. Then there is a Brazilian who has written Francisco something or the other. The reference is here. So essentially what it says is that these wars and other things had left a lot of widows. And they were also, so the viceroy was suggesting that some Portuguese gentlemen marry these widows and increase the population to defend the land. And in the process, he said, because there would be a language barrier, that these people should understand Konkani. The viceroy never says to ban it in that way. It says that, and it doesn't mention Konkani specifically, it mentions the local language, so it is applicable to the north as well. Now, there was also another issue to this. It was a religious aspect, religious in the sense between religious authorities. What had happened was most of these conversions and the other things had been done by religious organizations, that is the Franciscans, Jesuits and others. And the Franciscans were one of the forefront of this particular controversy on Konkani. The parishes were manned by local priests, the secular authority, and they spoke Konkani. The Franciscans did not, because many of them were from Portugal. Yeah. So when a particular directive was given, it's a little bit involved, that preaching should be done in a local language. This was also advised with the provincial councils. These Franciscans saw that some of these things slipping away and the revenue slipping away, so they convinced the viceroy to do something else. So it is a little bit of a... I
read the debate, and I really like the way you are presenting facts which challenge what we believe.
Yes.
Having said that, we've spent almost an hour talking on this vast topic. We can spend a lot much time. I know how many years you've spent on it, 4-5 years, because we've often been talking in conversation, and we know, people outside this small circuit might not know how much work goes into a book like this. Alan, I want to say thanks for putting it out there, for being open to the discussion. There are summaries of the book, so even if you decide not to buy the book, you can always read one of the summaries on the internet, which are quite elaborate, and I think you've done a great job of challenging what we have been believing so far. Thank you for all your work, and may you have many more books, because it not only enriches your understanding and everyone's understanding, but also Goa's understanding. I think this book should have come out from Goa, but Alan is actually a Mangalorean sitting in Bangalore, whom we are very proud of. Thank you.
Thank you.